Germany produced some of the most advanced aircraft engineering the world had ever seen. But advanced doesn't always mean pretty. If you're into aviation history, you don't want to miss, hit subscribe now, because this list gets stranger with every entry. Today, we're counting down 10 German aircraft so bizarre looking, you'd swear they were built as a dare. Number 10. VFW-Fokker 614. We're starting with something you might not expect on a list about wartime oddities, because this one is a Cold War era airliner, and it's proof that ugly design didn't end in 1945. The VFW-Fokker 614 first flew in 1971, a joint German-Dutch project meant to compete in the short-haul regional jet market. On paper, it should have worked. In reality, it looked like someone forgot to finish the design. The most jarring feature is the engine placement. Instead of hanging the turbofans under the wings like every sensible airliner, engineers mounted them on pylons above the wing, sitting high and awkward like two afterthoughts bolted on at the last minute. The reasoning was actually sound. Keeping the engines away from the ground reduced the risk of foreign object damage on smaller, less developed runways, and it kept the cabin quieter. But the visual result was a stubby little jet that looked top-heavy and unbalanced, like it was designed by committee and nobody checked the final sketch before construction started. Performance didn't help its case either. The aircraft was underpowered, slower than competitors, and plagued by delays. Only 19 were ever built. Launch customer LTU canceled its order outright after early testing revealed serious shortcomings, and the program never recovered. By the early 1980s, most of the surviving airframes had been withdrawn from commercial service, with a few repurposed for research, including one converted into an early fly-by-wire testbed for what would eventually become the Airbus program. So in a strange twist, this awkward, overweight, over-engined little jet ended up quietly influencing the future of European aviation, even as it failed commercially. It's a reminder that sometimes the ugliest aircraft in the room are also the most technically important, just not the most photogenic. Number 9. Focke-Wulf A16. Long before Focke-Wulf became synonymous with the fearsome FW-190 fighter, the company was building small, boxy passenger aircraft in the 1920s, and the A16 is where things get genuinely odd-looking by modern standards. First flown in 1924, this was a strut-braced high-wing monoplane designed to carry a handful of passengers on short regional hops across a Germany still rebuilding after the First World War. Everything about the A16 looks like early aviation improvisation. The fuselage is a tall, slab-sided box, almost like a shed with wings attached. Thin bracing struts run from the wings down to the fuselage at sharp angles, giving the whole aircraft a spindly, unfinished appearance. The fixed landing gear sits exposed underneath. No fairings, no attempt at streamlining, just bare wheels and struts hanging in the airflow. Passengers sat in an enclosed cabin, which was actually a step up for the era, while the pilot often flew from a semi-open cockpit up front, exposed to the wind and weather. What makes the A16 worth including isn't just the look though, it's the context. Post-Versailles Treaty restrictions severely limited German aircraft engine power for years, forcing designers like Focke-Wulf to prioritize lightweight, simple, low-powered airframes. That regulatory pressure is part of why the A16 looks the way it does. Form dictated entirely by restriction rather than aesthetics. Around 24 were built, serving with early regional carriers that would eventually be absorbed into Deutsche Lufthansa. It never won any beauty contests, but the A16 quietly represents the first steps of a company that would later produce some of the most feared fighters of the Second World War. Sometimes the ugly duckling really does grow up. Number 8. Blohm Voss BV 141. Now we get into genuinely strange engineering, the kind that makes people stop mid-scroll and ask, wait, is that fuselage on the wrong side? And yes, the answer is absolutely yes, on purpose. The Blohm Voss BV 141 is one of the most asymmetric aircraft ever to enter production, and once you understand why, it actually starts to make a twisted kind of sense. Designed by Richard Vogt as a reconnaissance and observation aircraft, the BV 141 has its crew pod mounted on the starboard side, a fully glazed, bug-eyed cockpit nacelle offering nearly unobstructed visibility in every direction. Meanwhile, the engine, tail boom, and empennage sit on the port side, running in a straight line separate from the crew compartment. From certain angles, it genuinely looks like two different aircraft that collided mid-assembly and got welded together by accident. The logic, though, was sound. Conventional single-engine observation planes forced the pilot to look past a nose-mounted engine and through a spinning propeller disc, which is a terrible way to spot enemy positions on the ground. By moving the crew pod entirely off to one side, Vogt gave observers a clear, unobstructed view forward, downward, and to the sides, exactly what reconnaissance crews needed. The asymmetric design also improved single-engine handling characteristics that conventional twin-boom designs struggled with, since torque and airflow were balanced by the deliberate offset. Roughly 20 to 25 were built and used on reconnaissance duties, mostly over the Eastern Front, where their unusual silhouette occasionally caused Soviet pilots to hesitate, unsure what kind of aircraft they were even looking at. Production was limited, partly due to bombing raids on the factory building the BMW engines, and partly because, frankly, it never scaled well. But as a piece of pure form-follows-function design taken to its most literal extreme, the BV-141 remains one of the strangest, most memorable silhouettes to ever leave the ground. Number 7. Messerschmitt Me 323 Gigant. If the previous entries were odd, the Me 323 Gigant is just enormous, and enormous has its own kind of ugly. This is one of the largest land-based transport aircraft of the Second World War, a lumbering six-engine beast that started life not as a powered aircraft at all, but as a glider. The Me 321 Gigant glider was originally designed to carry heavy cargo and armored vehicles into battle behind a tow plane, but towing something this massive proved dangerous and impractical. The solution was to bolt on 6 French-built Gnome-Rhone radial engines salvaged from captured stock, turning the glider into a lumbering powered transport. The result is an aircraft with a boxy, slab-sided fuselage nearly the size of a barn, a high cantilever wing stretching well over 50 meters, and a fixed multi-wheeled landing gear cluster underneath that looks more like something off a farm tractor than an aircraft. Loading was done through massive clamshell doors in the nose, allowing crews to drive tanks, artillery, and dozens of troops directly into the cargo hold, genuinely ahead of its time in terms of cargo aircraft design. But the trade-off was brutal. The Me 323 cruised at barely 130 miles per hour, was desperately underpowered for its size, and had almost no defensive capability against fighters. German crews grimly nicknamed it the Leukoplast bomber, or Elastoplast bomber, referring to the fabric and plywood construction that looked more like a field patch job than a proper aircraft. Its most infamous moment came in April 1943 during a resupply mission over the Mediterranean toward Tunisia, when a formation of these giants flying low and slow with no fighter escort was intercepted by Allied fighters and effectively wiped out in a matter of minutes. It's a brutal reminder that being big and strange-looking doesn't make you safe, especially not at 130 miles per hour with virtually no way to fight back. Number 6. Heinkel He 162 Volksjäger. We close out this half of the list with an aircraft born entirely out of desperation, and it looks like it. By late 1944, Germany was losing the air war badly, and the Reich Air Ministry demanded a jet fighter that could be mass-produced by semi-skilled labor, using non-strategic materials, and built in a matter of weeks. What came out of that impossible brief was the He 162 Volksjäger, the people's fighter. Visually, the aircraft is deeply awkward. A single BMW turbojet engine sits mounted directly on top of the fuselage, right behind the cockpit, sticking up like a barrel strapped to the pilot's back. The wings had a noticeable dihedral angle to compensate for the weight sitting up high, and twin tail fins were added late in development after testing revealed serious stability issues. Much of the airframe, including the wings, was built from wood rather than aluminum, since Germany's metal supplies were being funneled almost entirely into other programs by this stage of the war. The rush timeline shows in the aircraft's history. The prototype crashed fatally during a public demonstration flight just 12 days after its first flight, when a wing separated in mid-air due to a structural and adhesive failure in the wooden construction. Despite this, production continued under immense pressure, with the ministry pushing plans to eventually train Hitler Youth glider pilots with minimal flight hours to fly it in a last-ditch effort at aerial defense. Most of those plans never materialized before the war ended, and pilots who did fly it in combat found it twitchy, unforgiving, and dangerous even in experienced hands. Around 300 were completed before Germany's collapse, making it one of the more numerous jet aircraft of the war, despite the fact that it was designed, tested, and rushed into limited production in under 6 months. It's an aircraft that looks exactly like what it was, a last, desperate gamble built under an engine sitting in entirely the wrong place. Number 5. Arado Ar 232 Millipede. Nicknamed the Millipede for good reason, the Arado Ar 232 is one of the strangest looking transport aircraft Germany ever fielded, and the nickname comes from something you can't miss the moment you see it from the side. A long row of small auxiliary wheels running underneath the fuselage, sitting between the main landing gear, like tiny legs on an insect. Those wheels weren't decoration. Designed to operate from rough, unprepared frontline airstrips, the R232 needed a way to taxi over uneven terrain and rutted ground without collapsing its main gear or getting stuck. The solution was this row of small, spring-loaded wheels running the length of the lower fuselage, letting the aircraft essentially crawl over rough surfaces like a vehicle on a track system. On smooth runways, the main gear alone handled takeoff and landing, but the moment the ground got rough, the little wheels took the load, flexing and absorbing impacts the main gear couldn't handle alone. The rest of the aircraft looks almost conventional by comparison, a high-wing, twin-tail boom design similar in concept to other transports of the era, with a boxy fuselage and a rear loading ramp for quick cargo handling. But that Millipede undercarriage dominates the silhouette so completely that it turns an otherwise unremarkable transport into one of the oddest shapes to ever roll down a runway. Only a handful were built, roughly 20 in total, split between 2 and 4 engine variants, and most served on the Eastern Front hauling supplies into forward airstrips that would have destroyed a conventional transport's landing gear in a single mission. It's not glamorous, it's not fast, and it's definitely not elegant, but few aircraft solved a practical battlefield problem in a way that looked quite this unusual. Number 4. Blohm Voss BV 138 Flying Clog. If you've ever seen a photo of this aircraft and immediately thought that doesn't look right, you're not alone. The BV 138 earned the nickname Flying Clog from German aircrews themselves, and one look at the boat-shaped central hull explains exactly why. This is a large flying boat built for long-range maritime reconnaissance over the North Atlantic and Arctic waters, and it looks like nothing else in the German inventory. The design centers around a short, deep boat-hulled fuselage that genuinely resembles an oversized wooden shoe, wide and blunt at the front, tapering awkwardly toward the tail. Mounted above and behind that hull sits a thick slab-like wing, and from that wing hang 3 engine nacelles in a row, each one blending directly into a tail boom that stretches back to a twin-fin tail assembly. There's no single fuselage running the length of the aircraft the way you'd expect. Instead, everything looks bolted together from separate, mismatched sections, giving it a lumpy, disjointed silhouette that only gets stranger the longer you look at it. Despite the awkward looks, the BV-138 proved to be a genuinely capable long-range patrol aircraft once early structural problems were ironed out. It could stay airborne for over 16 hours, giving it enormous range for shadowing Allied convoys crossing the North Atlantic and relaying their positions back to U-boat wolf packs waiting to intercept them. Roughly 300 were built, and crews came to rely on its rugged hull and stable low-speed handling for open ocean landings in genuinely rough seas, something sleeker aircraft simply couldn't manage. It never looked like it belonged in the sky, and honestly, with that hull shape, it looked like it belonged even less on water. But the Flying Clog did both jobs for years, proving that sometimes the strangest shape is the one nobody expects to work. Number 3. Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. Now, you might be surprised to see the Stuka on this list, since it's one of the most recognizable German aircraft of the entire war. But recognizable doesn't mean elegant, and if you actually stop and look at the Ju-87 with fresh eyes, ignoring decades of documentary footage and video games, it's a genuinely strange-looking machine. Start with the wings. Instead of a straight or tapered shape, the Stuka has a distinctive inverted gull wing, bending sharply downward from the fuselage before angling back up toward the tips. That bend wasn't for style. It shortened the required landing gear length while still keeping the propeller clear of the ground, and it improved the pilot's downward visibility during steep dive attacks. But visually, it gives the aircraft a hunched, almost predatory posture, like it's permanently crouched and ready to pounce, even sitting still on the tarmac. Then there's the fixed landing gear, encased in large, boxy spats that never retracted, sticking out from the wings like a pair of oversized boots. Most fighters and dive bombers of the era had moved toward retractable gear for speed and aerodynamics, but the Stuka kept its legs permanently exposed, adding drag and giving the whole aircraft an ungainly, almost comical stance from the front. And then there's the sound most people associate with it, the Jericho trumpet sirens mounted on the landing gear legs specifically to shriek during dives and terrify ground troops, a psychological weapon bolted directly onto an already odd-looking airframe. Roughly 6,000 were built, and the Stuka became infamous for its role in blitzkrieg tactics tactics across Poland, France, and the early stages of the war in the East, delivering pinpoint dive-bombing strikes with terrifying accuracy. By the time Allied fighters gained air superiority later in the war, its slow speed and fixed gear turned it into an easy target, and losses mounted quickly. It's proof that a genuinely bizarre-looking aircraft can still become one of the most feared weapons of an entire era, right up until the balance of air power shifts against it. Number 2. Bachem Ba 349 Natter. Few aircraft on this list look less like an aircraft and more like a missile than the Bachem Ba 349 Natter, and that's basically what it was. Conceived in the final desperate months of the war as a point defense interceptor, the Natter was designed to be built almost entirely from wood, launched vertically off a rail like a rocket, and flown, if it can even be called flying, straight up into a formation of Allied bombers. The airframe itself is stubby and blunt, barely resembling a conventional aircraft at all. Small, straight, unswept wings sit close to a short tube-like fuselage packed with a rocket motor and additional strap-on boosters for launch. There's no landing gear at all because the Natter was never meant to land conventionally. After firing its single volley of unguided rockets at a bomber formation, the pilot was meant to bail out, and separately, the tail section containing the rocket motor would parachute down for reuse, since these expensive engines were too valuable to waste on a single flight. The entire concept relied on a barely trained pilot enduring roughly 12 Gs of vertical acceleration off the launch rail, reaching the altitude of enemy bombers in under a minute, firing a spread of rockets, and then getting out alive. It's an aircraft built around the assumption that its pilot was expendable by design, not by accident. Only one manned test flight was ever attempted in March 1945, and it ended in the pilot's death when the canopy detached and struck him during the violent climb. The war ended before the Natter ever saw combat, and it's genuinely hard to imagine it working as intended, even if it had. It looks less like an aircraft and more like a warning sign of just how far German engineering had been pushed by that point in the war, when raw desperation started outrunning basic aviation sense entirely. Number 1. Dornier Delphin. We're closing out the list with something completely different, an aircraft that looks less like a warplane and more like a prop from an early science fiction film. The Dornier Delphin, or Dolphin, was a commercial flying boat from the 1920s, and its rounded bulbous hull and stacked engine layout make it one of the strangest civilian aircraft ever to carry paying passengers. The hull is the standout feature, a fat, rounded boat-like fuselage that genuinely looks inflated, tapering awkwardly toward a narrow tail. Sitting above the wing, mounted on a short pylon, are twin engines arranged in a push-pull configuration, one facing forward, one facing backward, sharing a single nacelle perched well above the passenger cabin like some kind of mechanical crown. Struts and bracing wires run in every direction, connecting the wing, hull, and engine pylon, giving the whole aircraft a tangled, unfinished look, as if the designers ran out of time before cleaning up the final structure. Despite its bizarre proportions, the Delphin served a genuine purpose. Early European airlines needed flying boats that could operate from harbors and rivers without requiring paved runways, and Dornier had already built a reputation for tough, reliable hulls with the earlier wall design. The Delphin scaled that concept down into a passenger-carrying configuration, flying commercial routes across parts of Europe through the mid to late 1920s, carrying a handful of passengers in a fully enclosed cabin, itself an upgrade over the open cockpit still common at the time. It never flew in huge numbers and never fought in a war, but it earns its place at the top of this list simply because of how alien it looks compared to everything else in the sky during that era. Bulbous, top-heavy, and strung together with visible bracing wires, the Delphin proves that you don't need a war to produce a genuinely strange-looking flying machine. Sometimes peacetime engineering gets just as weird, and that closes out our list of 10 of the ugliest aircraft Germany ever put into the sky. From wooden last-ditch interceptors to millipede wheeled transports, these machines prove that function rarely cares about form. If you enjoyed this one, let us know in the comments which aircraft surprised you the most, and we'll see you in the next video.